Well, hello and welcome to lecture number 5 for this class. Today I want to talk about a political reform movement called the Progressive Movement. The time period to be covered would be the late 1800s up to about 1917. There are many themes to be covered when studying the Progressive Movement. The past few lectures have addressed a variety of problems associated with the United States in the late 1800s up to about 1900 as the nation rapidly industrialized. The Progressive Movement was designed to reform society and resolve some of those problems facing the nation. We'll start with some background information and then investigate the wide range of goals and accomplishments of different progressive reformers. Overall, you should think of how you would evaluate the accomplishments of this era of American history, as well as the actions of different progressive reformers at the state and national level. Some background information as to the different wings of the progressive movement, as well as influential journalists, would be a good place to start. Because there were so many different individuals with a variety of goals included in this progressive movement, historians have sometimes organized the movement into the so-called three wings. The first of these wings would be the social justice wing. Their goal was to improve general living and working conditions for people in the United States. Secondly, there would be the democratic wing. Their goal was to eliminate corruption in politics and also to try to promote more involvement by the American people in the political process. Lastly, there would be the anti-monopoly wing. They were concerned with the growth of monopolies and big businesses because they thought that they hurt the American people and consumers in general. The term muckraker was used to describe a group of journalists who began to shape public opinion in the United States. They were investigative reporters who emphasized facts and specific conditions they observed rather than describing conditions in generalities. There were many influential muckraking journalists, including Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell, and Upton Sinclair, who will be discussed in more detail later in this lecture. The person who gave them this nickname was the President, Theodore Roosevelt. Muckrakers were important because they exposed so many of the problems facing the nation during this era. There were a variety of different leaders in the progressive movement. They also had a wide range of accomplishments. I'll talk about those who worked at the state and local level first. One person who was influenced by the conditions that she faced, as well as the articles of the muckraking journalist, was Jane Addams. She was born in Chicago and in 1889 purchased an old dilapidated building and renamed it Hull House. She was concerned about the problems faced by many poor and immigrants in the United States and established Hull Houses kind of like a homeless shelter for the poor. They held a variety of different classes, some of which were in English and in civics. They also set up a kindergarten, a laundry, and what we would now call today a daycare for working mothers. In many ways, she was a pioneer social worker, one of the first in the United States, and by 1895 there were over 50 of these settlement houses in many different parts of the United States. Another progressive reformer at the state level was Governor Bob La Follette, who became famous for his so-called Wisconsin idea. This was developed after several meetings with experts from the University of Wisconsin. There were a variety of goals included in the Wisconsin idea. Here are a few. They called for the conservation of natural resources so that they could be used for many years into the future. He also promoted democracy by calling for the direct election of United States senators. And they called for an income tax for corporate incomes and personal income taxes. By the late 19-teens, we see a variety of accomplishments at the state level whereby state governments were regulating businesses. For example, 30 states had outlawed child labor by 1907, and by 1914, at least 25 states had passed laws making employers liable for either deaths or injuries for workers while on the job. Now I'd like to look at a leader at the national level by focusing on a progressive president. That president was Theodore Roosevelt. The President of the United States was also influenced by the ideals of the progressive movement, and this man, Theodore Roosevelt, occupied the White House from 1901 to 1909. He first gained national attention during the Spanish-American War, and in 1900 he became William McKinley's vice president. However, in 1901 McKinley was assassinated, and Roosevelt took over following his death. You can click on the hyperlink below to more information about Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt had a unique background and a lasting impact on the presidency. He was born to an aristocratic family in New York and very often spent his summers in Wyoming in order to improve his health. In the mid-1880s, he lived as a cowboy of sorts in the Dakotas following the death of his wife. He once boasted to a friend, "I believe in a strong executive," and this philosophy influenced the presidency during his administration and in the following administrations by expanding the power of the president. Now that we've looked at some background information concerning the life of Theodore Roosevelt, we can investigate some of his accomplishments while serving in the White House. The first area I would like to explore would be labor and the United Mine Workers. The mine workers waged a strike in 1902 over wages and hours, as well as recognition of their union. The mine owners refused to even meet with the union leaders. Roosevelt called both sides to the White House and offered a mediation for the dispute. Now, in the end, the strikers didn't achieve all of their goals. However, this was an important victory for labor because Roosevelt defended labor's right to organize. Another issue involved Roosevelt's attitude toward big business and monopoly. This was seen with the Northern Securities case. The Northern Securities Company was owned by J.P. Morgan, and it held a virtual monopoly over railroads in the Northwest. President Roosevelt directed the Attorney General to go after this business and to try to get it broken up to protect the American people. In 1904, the Supreme Court agreed and ordered that the company be dissolved. This was important because it earned Roosevelt the reputation as a trust buster. The third area I would like to look at would be Roosevelt and his beliefs that business should be regulated. This was influenced by the publication of The Jungle in 1906. The Jungle was written by a muckraking journalist named Upton Sinclair. This described many of the problems associated with the meatpacking industry in the United States. Sinclair described in gruesome detail many of the processes associated with meat production in the United States. Here's one selection. A man could run his hands over these piles of meat and sweep off the handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them, and they would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. As if that wasn't enough to bring about change, the Jungle also described many living and working conditions faced very often by immigrant families in the United States. The impact was tremendous. Muckrakers were investigative reporters who emphasized facts and specific conditions they observed rather than describing. In response to the publication of The Jungle, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed in 1906. I want to identify two main points to this. First of all, it required accurate labeling of ingredients. Secondly, it also established sanitary requirements for meat. Basically, you couldn't sell spoiled meat, and it also provided money for inspectors in order to enforce those regulations. Roosevelt stepped down from the White House in 1909, but there were two other presidents who were influenced by the progressive movement who followed him. William Howard Taft was president from 1909 to 1913, and he was essentially Roosevelt's hand-picked successor. In many ways, he busted more trust than Roosevelt, but he didn't seek the limelight, so many didn't realize the extent of his progressive actions. Woodrow Wilson was president from 1913 to 21. Before he entered the White House, he was a college professor and also served as governor of New Jersey. Among other things, he was president when several so-called progressive amendments became part of the Constitution. Now, there were several amendments that were passed in the 19-teens. However, I want to focus on the 16th, 17th, and 19th. The 16th Amendment became part of the Constitution in 1913. This gave Congress the authority to impose an income tax. Shortly thereafter, they implemented an income tax. The maximum rate was 7% for people who had incomes over $500,000 a year. The 17th Amendment became part of the Constitution in 1917, and it reflects many of the ideas of those political reformers. This called for the direct election of American senators by voters in each state. Formerly, each state's legislature chose the 2 senators from each state. Now, the people would be more involved. The third so-called progressive amendment I'd like to address would be the 19th Amendment, but I'd like to start with some background first. The 19th Amendment dealt with women and the right to vote. This map, I think, is interesting because it identifies states with full voting rights for women before 1920. Green states were states where women had full voting rights before 1920. Notice how many of them are clustered in the western half of the United States. There was quite a debate over women's suffrage because many critics believed that a woman's place was in the home, not in the political sphere. We see this political cartoon on the left reflects many of these ideas. It was actually during the First World War that supporters of women and the right to vote finally got enough support in order to change the Constitution. Simply put, the 19th Amendment guaranteed all adult women the right to vote. I did want to mention something about the end of the progressive movement. In 1917, the United States became involved in the First World War, so in many ways the movement ended at this point. However, it did not end abruptly. As was seen in the previous few slides when it came to the amendments to the Constitution, in some ways, by the late 19-teens and even up into the early 1920s, we see the progressive movement continuing. However, for the most part, the impetus for change ended in many ways with American involvement in World War I. That concludes the core of the lecture today, but I did want to offer a few ideas in terms of evaluation. Today I tried to talk about a variety of issues associated with the progressive movement. This was a movement at the national and the state level, which tried to resolve many of the problems facing the United States in the early 1900s. You might want to evaluate this movement. How successful were they in accomplishing their goals? Overall, what do you believe to be their most important accomplishment? The following slides include a list of sources as well as hyperlinks to websites offering additional information if you want to learn more about the progressive movement.